Welcome to this special program, The Quest for God. Since ancient times, people around the world have been searching for God. In every culture, people have sought earnestly to find someone up there, using everything from quiet meditation to martyrdom. They've offered sacrifices, followed complex rituals, and even endured physical pain. For the Mayas in Central America, the quest was symbolized by a hand catching a fish, slippery, elusive, and nearly impossible to grasp. Their gods were serpents, warriors, and ancestors, and the Mayas often went to violent extremes to appease them. For 1,300 years, Tikal was the heart of the Mayan civilization. It was called the City of Voices. In their temples, priests performed sacrifices and studied the stars. And some believe they predicted the end of the world. The Mayan long count calendar is even more accurate than our own. But it says that on December 21st, 2012, the long count of time will revert to zero.
During the Classic period, they made a series of inscriptions in stone. They mention the beginning and the end of this era, but they don't say anything further about what will happen. Some people believe this 5,125-year cycle will end catastrophically, that it will be the end of the world as we know it.
The Mayas believed their lives depended on observing the sky and predicting the future.
They relied on the corn harvest to subsist, so they needed to know how the future, rainy seasons, and the weather in general would affect their crops.
It was also very important to the Mayas to get the attention of their gods. They wanted their acknowledgement and their blessing for a better future.
To get the attention of their gods and ancestors, the early Mayas sacrificed blood, their own blood.
They believed that gods actually created man from corn. To bring that corn to life, the gods had to sacrifice their own blood. The Mayans felt in debt to them and gave their blood in return.
In their efforts to get closer to the gods, Mayas went into long periods of fasting and isolation. But they could only enter into the presence of God after extreme self-sacrifice. Sandstone carvings show the rituals performed in Mayan vision ceremonies. With a stingray spine, a woman pierces her tongue. The more painful the ritual, the more valuable the blood.
We believe they drank some sort of intoxicating substance and then performed these rituals. The pain itself was very important. So through this hole in the tongue, they ran a cord, sometimes laced with thorns and obsidian blades. Then they collected the blood on scrolls, which they burned. The smoke and the blood rose into the sky to the gods.
From the burning scrolls rises the image of a serpent, and perhaps an ancestor, god or ancient king. But the vision is elusive. Carved into this stone is the Mayan glyph for conjure. It consists of a hand grasping a fish. To the Mayas, seeing a vision is like reaching into a flowing stream to catch a fish. Hard to control and easy to lose.
If we read it literally, it only says conjure. It doesn't even say vision. After all of her suffering, this doesn't necessarily say she was successful in seeing anything.
During the early years of the Mayan civilization, even kings performed these painful rituals, desperately seeking the gods on behalf of their people. Over the centuries, the great Mayan empire crumbled, and their cities and temples were abandoned and lost in the jungle. Still, remnants of the culture remained.
There was a blending of cultures from Mexico and the Mayan territories. It seems there was a moment when a divine thirst for blood sprung up.
In the 16th century, Spanish monk Diego de Landa wrote of witnessing Mayan priests trying to reach God by sacrificing captives.
They hurt him with great skill and cruelty, cutting him with a knife between the ribs on the left side. The priest reached into his chest and grabbed his heart like a rabid tiger, snatching it. Then they put his heart on a plate.
Many of the ancient rituals died with the priests, who were killed by Spanish soldiers in what came to be known as the Mexican Inquisition. But their culture didn't completely disappear. Gilberto Chayax is a modern Mayan priest.
What we're doing with the ceremonies, with the sacred fire, is asking God to give us His blessing, to teach us how to live well, to bring peace to our countries, and to bless our families. We conjure Him so He can speak to us through the fire.
To this day, descendants of the Mayas still practice many ancient traditions. They offer sacrifices and conjure visions, all in hopes of pleasing the gods and catching an elusive glimpse of eternity. In ancient Greece, that glimpse of eternity was just as elusive. According to Greek mythology, the gods lived on Mount Olympus, and their contact with humans was rare. The Greeks believed that only a few people were chosen to hear the voice of the gods, and the most famous one was the Oracle of Delphi. She was the most powerful woman in the ancient world, the priestess of Apollo, also known as the Oracle of Delphi.
The oracle is one of the ways in which the gods manifested their will to humans.
Kings, emperors, and generals sought her advice. Wars started and ended on her counsel. To the ancient Greeks, she was the voice of God. In Greek mythology, the city of Delphi was the home of the Python, a giant serpent who terrorized humans. The legend says that the Greek god Apollo killed the Python, whose corpse then fell into a large crevice in the earth. Powerful vapors rose up from the crevice, causing hallucinations when they were inhaled. The people of Delphi believed the fumes came from the rotting corpse of the Python, and that they gave mortals a way to hear messages from Apollo.
Apollo is a new god who was born to bring the gift of prophecy to humans and therefore bridge the gap between Zeus and humanity.
The people of Delphi built a shrine over the crevice and appointed a woman to inhale the vapors and communicate with Apollo on their behalf. This priestess was called the Pythia, after the decaying python underground. She also became known as the Oracle of Delphi. For the most part, the Pythias were ordinary women with no special skills. The only requirement was a good reputation.
The idea was that she needed to be very pure in order to communicate with Apollo. And so part of the purity was that she would become chaste. And I say become chaste because she need not have been chaste earlier in her life. She may well have been a woman who married and had children, but when she agreed to become the Pythia, she would not live with her husband any longer. She lived within the sanctuary of Apollo at Delphi.
The first oracles were teenage virgins, but the job proved too risky for the young girls, who were often molested by the men who came to Delphi. So the priests later decided that only older women would be appointed.
These women who served as the Pythia often would serve until they died, so they would remain chaste then from that moment till the end of their lives.
From all over the world, people flocked to Delphi to get what they believed was a message from God. Delphi became the center of the world.
If one wanted to approach the oracle, one had to bring a goat, and the priests would sprinkle some water on the goat. If the goat started shaking, and shaking pretty violently, then it was an auspicious moment to go and consult the oracle. If the goat did not shake, the god was letting you know that it wasn't a good moment.
The Greek historian Plutarch was a priest at Delphi, and he wrote about what happened when the Pythia was forced to prophesy at the wrong time.
Her behavior became so erratic that she collapsed, and the priests and the inquirer came in to kind of see what was going on. They found her collapsed and kind of ran screaming away, and she passed away a few days after that.
The oracle prophesied once a month for 9 months out of the year in an underground chamber called the Adyton. In the Temple of Apollo, this was the Holy of Holies. Only the Pythia and a priest were allowed inside, while lines of inquirers waited nearby. Each person was allowed one question. The priest then posed the question to the oracle. Intoxicated by the vapors, she fell into a trance and raved in ecstasy.
Plutarch said that when the Pythia came out of these trances, it was like a dancer who had danced for a long time or a runner who had finished a race.
For centuries, these fumes were a mystery to scholars and scientists. Ancient sources describe a fragrant breeze that rose from the temple and covered the city of Delphi. And in the 1990s, geologists found 2 fault lines that crossed exactly at the center of Apollo's temple, the spot where the oracle sat.
Indeed, there are gases that could have been emitted from those clefts in the rock, and in particular, one of the gases would have been ethylene, which is known to be a mild anesthetic and could well have induced a kind of trance.
The Greeks believed that the Pythia was possessed by the spirit of Apollo. The priest then translated her words into poetic prophecies.
It's up to humans to interpret correctly what the god says. So it is a matter of human choice whether they will understand and interpret correctly and make the right choice that accords with divine will, as opposed to them, blindly following instruction.
The oracle's cryptic answers made it possible for her to be right most of the time. If inquirers got the wrong interpretation, that was their fault. Case in point, the Lydian king Croesus.
He had designs to fight the Persians, and so he consulted the oracle at Delphi and asked whether he should fight. And the response of the oracle was that if he did fight, a mighty empire would fall. And he went ahead thinking, great, I will conquer the Persians. But of course, what happened was that it was not the Persian Empire that fell, but his own.
The first Roman emperor to consult the oracle was Nero. And when he arrived in Delphi, the Pythia greeted him with a warning.
Your presence here outrages the god you seek. The number 73 marks the hour of your downfall.
Nero was so angry that he ordered the Pythia to be buried alive. But within the year, he too was dead, after being overthrown by a 73-year-old man. Throughout the ancient world, the power of the oracle went unquestioned for more than 1,000 years.
Even, and this is very interesting, when the early Christian fathers start writing about the oracle and cautioning against it, they don't disbelieve in the power of the oracle. Rather, what they see the problem being is that some kind of evil force, namely the devil, is the one behind those prophecies.
Over time, the oracle's reputation began to fade. An earthquake destroyed the Temple of Apollo. It was later rebuilt, but the earthquake had changed the landscape at Delphi forever.
The gases, the vapors, are not as strong anymore, that they seem to have abated in some way. And so we may wonder whether something was getting blocked up. And so there might be a very practical reason that the oracle is in a bit of decline and that she is not able, that the Pythia is not able to give as many responses as she had been before.
In AD 303, the Roman Emperor Diocletian consulted another priestess of Apollo in the Greek city of Didyma. The oracle told him that the word of Apollo was being hindered by the just on earth. Diocletian's advisors told him the oracle was talking about the Christians. And later that year, he launched the bloodiest persecution in the history of the Roman Empire. But a decade later, the Christians rose to power in Rome, and the oracle's days were numbered.
As Christianity spreads, and especially as there is a sort of legal mandate to stop going to pagan temples, then, of course, you're really talking about pretty much the end of the oracle at Delphi.
In AD 380, the Roman Emperor Theodosius ordered the destruction of every pagan temple in the empire, including the one at Delphi. 13 years later, the oracle made her final statement.
Tell the king, the fair-wrought house has fallen. No shelter has Apollo. The fountains are now silent. The voice is stilled. It is finished.
For centuries, the ancient Greeks flocked to Delphi to hear what they believed was the voice of God. While further east in India, thousands of Hindus sought not just to hear God, but to become God.